Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My name is Harrison, and I want to tell you about the day I realized that winning everything I thought I wanted meant losing the only thing that actually mattered. I met Rachel when we were both 26, working entry-level jobs in Boston and sharing cheap apartments with too many roommates. She was a kindergarten teacher making $32,000 a year, and I was a junior analyst at a tech startup that paid me just enough to afford ramen noodles and dreams of something bigger. Our first date was at a dive bar in Cambridge where we split a pitcher of beer and talked until closing time about everything and nothing. She had this laugh that started in her chest and bubbled up like champagne, and these warm brown eyes that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world when she looked at you. Rachel wore thrift store dresses that she altered herself, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a duct-taped bumper, and somehow made poverty look elegant. What I loved most about her was how she saw magic in ordinary things. She'd get excited about finding a perfect leaf on our walks, or discovering a new coffee shop, or watching her students master reading their first sentence. She had this way of making every day feel like an adventure, even when we were too broke to do anything but walk around the city and window shop. We moved in together after 8 months, splitting a one-bedroom apartment in Somerville that was barely bigger than a closet but felt like a palace because we were sharing it. Rachel would grade papers at our secondhand kitchen table while I worked on my laptop beside her, both of us chasing different versions of the American dream. Her version involved shaping young minds and making a difference in kids' lives. Mine involved making enough money so we never had to worry about rent again. The startup I worked for got acquired 2 years later, and suddenly I was holding stock options worth more than Rachel made in 3 years. It wasn't life-changing money yet, but it was hope-changing money. I started seeing possibilities I'd never imagined before. I proposed on a Tuesday night in our tiny apartment with a ring I'd saved 6 months to afford. Nothing fancy, just a simple solitaire that looked enormous on her delicate fingers. She said yes while wearing paint-stained pajamas, and we celebrated with Chinese takeout and cheap wine, planning a wedding we'd pay for with credit cards and optimism. We married in her parents' backyard in Vermont, a simple ceremony with 30 guests and wildflowers Rachel had picked herself that morning. I remember standing at that makeshift altar, watching her walk toward me in a dress she'd found at a consignment shop and somehow made look like it was designed specifically for her, thinking that I was the richest man alive despite having maybe $3,000 to my name. The early years of marriage were a study in creative frugality. Date nights meant cooking dinner at home and watching movies from the library. Vacations were camping trips or visits to family. We furnished our apartment with finds from estate sales and Craigslist, and Rachel had this gift for making everything look intentional and beautiful instead of desperate and cheap. But I was already thinking bigger. The tech industry was exploding, and I had ideas. I started working on a business plan for my own company, spending nights and weekends developing concepts for productivity software that could revolutionize how small businesses operated. Rachel would bring me coffee and sandwiches while I worked, listening patiently as I explained algorithms and market penetration strategies she probably found boring as hell. She never complained about the long hours or the way my attention was increasingly divided between her and my ambitions. When I finally scraped together enough money to quit my job and launch Harrison Technologies, she took a summer tutoring job to help cover our expenses, never once suggesting that maybe I was being reckless or naive. The first 2 years of running my own company were brutal. 18-hour days, constant rejection from investors, months when I couldn't pay myself a salary, and Rachel covered all our bills on her teacher's income. There were nights when I'd come home defeated, ready to give up and go back to working for someone else, and she'd remind me why I'd started this journey in the first place. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She'd listen to my pitches and offer suggestions that were surprisingly insightful for someone who'd never worked in tech. She celebrated every small victory, landing a new client, hiring my first employee, getting our first positive review like they were Nobel Prizes. The breakthrough came in year 3. A major corporation needed exactly what we'd built, and suddenly we went from scraping by to signing a contract worth more money than I'd ever seen in my life. More contracts followed. We hired more employees, moved to better offices, started talking to investors about scaling nationally. I was working 80-hour weeks, but the money was finally flowing. Real money, life-changing money. I bought Rachel a new car, traded our tiny apartment for a 2-bedroom place in a better neighborhood, took her on a real vacation to Italy where we stayed in actual hotels instead of hostels. She was happy about the improvements in our lifestyle, but I started noticing that she seemed less excited about my success than I expected. When I'd come home buzzing with excitement about a new deal or a potential expansion opportunity, her responses felt polite rather than enthusiastic. She'd ask about my day and listen to my answers, but I could see her attention drifting, like she was waiting for the conversation to shift to something else. I told myself she just didn't understand business, that the details of revenue growth and market share weren't as thrilling to her as they were to me. I was building something that would secure our future, give us the kind of life we'd never dared dream about when we were splitting pitchers of beer and sharing ramen noodles. By year 5, Harrison Technologies was generating serious revenue. We had 40 employees, offices in 3 cities, and venture capital firms calling me instead of the other way around. I was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in industry publications, recognized as one of the city's most promising young entrepreneurs. The success was intoxicating. Not just the money, though there was certainly plenty of that, but the respect, the recognition, the feeling that I was building something meaningful. Every deal felt like validation, every expansion like proof that I'd been right to take those early risks. I bought us a house in Newton, a beautiful colonial with a 3-car garage and a yard big enough for the kids we kept saying we'd have someday. Rachel seemed overwhelmed by the size and formality of it, but she threw herself into decorating with the same creative energy she'd once used to make our tiny apartment feel like home. The money kept coming. I hired a financial advisor, started investing in real estate, began talking to other entrepreneurs about acquiring smaller companies. Every success made me hungry for more success. Every milestone became a launching pad for the next goal. Rachel's reaction to our new lifestyle was complicated. She enjoyed the security, the ability to buy things without checking our bank balance first, the freedom from the constant low-level stress of living paycheck to paycheck. But she seemed uncomfortable with the excess, the way money could solve problems that used to require creativity and compromise. When I surprised her with a diamond necklace for her birthday, something that cost more than she used to make in 6 months, her first reaction was to ask if we could afford it. When I laughed and said we could afford 10 of them, she didn't laugh back. She thanked me and wore it to dinner, but I caught her checking the price tag later, and her expression looked more troubled than pleased. I was working 12 to 14 hours a day by then, including most weekends. The company was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible, and every opportunity felt urgent, every decision critical. I told myself that this was temporary, that once we reached the next level of success, I'd be able to step back and enjoy what we'd built together. Rachel never complained directly about my schedule, but I could feel her pulling away. She stopped waiting up for me when I worked late. She made plans with friends on weekends without checking if I'd be available. When I'd finally get home exhausted and wired from another day of high-stakes meetings and million-dollar decisions, she'd already be asleep or reading quietly in bed, offering a sleepy kiss goodnight before turning back to her book. Our conversations became increasingly logistical. Who was picking up dry cleaning, what needed to be done to the house, when we were supposed to have dinner with her parents. The easy intimacy of our early years, when we talked for hours about dreams and fears and random observations about the world, gave way to efficient information exchanges between 2 people sharing space but living separate lives. I missed her, but I told myself that missing her was the price of success. Every successful entrepreneur I knew had made similar sacrifices. You couldn't build an empire while maintaining the same level of attention to personal relationships you'd had when you were nobody. The money I was making would buy us decades of quality time together once I'd established the business well enough to step back. The irony was that the more successful I became, the more I needed Rachel to ground me, to remind me who I'd been before the success and who I wanted to be after it. But the more I needed her, the less available I was to actually connect with her. I was caught in a cycle where work stress made me crave the comfort of her presence, but work demands made that presence impossible to fully enjoy. I started buying her expensive gifts as a way to show appreciation for her patience, her support, her willingness to build a life around my ambitions. Jewelry, designer clothes, a spa weekend with her sister, a new car she hadn't asked for. Each gift was a token of gratitude, but also a hedge against guilt, a way to prove that my priorities hadn't really shifted even though my calendar suggested otherwise. Rachel accepted the gifts gracefully, but I could see they made her uncomfortable. She'd wear the jewelry when we went out, drive the car because she needed transportation, use the spa certificates because they'd already been purchased, but none of it sparked the joy I hoped to see. If anything, the gifts seemed to make her sad in ways I couldn't understand. One night, after a particularly brutal week of investor meetings and contract negotiations, I came home to find Rachel sitting at our kitchen table grading papers, just like she'd done in our tiny apartment years earlier. The sight of her there, surrounded by construction paper hearts and crayon drawings, made me realize how long it had been since I really looked at her. She was still beautiful, still had that luminous smile, but there was something different in her eyes. A distance that hadn't been there before, a kind of resigned sadness that made my chest ache. When I asked if she was okay, she said she was fine, just tired from a long day with her kids. For a moment, it felt like old times, the two of us working side by side, building our separate dreams in the same space. But when I tried to tell her about my day, about the potential acquisition deal that could triple our revenue, she listened with that same polite attention I'd been getting for months. When I asked about her day, she mentioned a few kids who were struggling with reading, a parent conference that had gone well, a field trip she was planning for spring. Her world sounded so small compared to the deals and decisions that filled my days. I found myself half listening, part of my mind already moving ahead to the next day's challenges. When she finished talking, there was an awkward silence that would never have existed in our tiny apartment days. That's when I realized we'd become strangers who shared a mortgage. The next morning, I woke up before dawn to prep for another crucial meeting, and Rachel was still sleeping. I kissed her forehead gently, promising myself that I'd plan something special for us soon, a weekend getaway maybe, or a dinner at that restaurant she'd mentioned liking. But first, I had a company to run, investors to impress, competitors to outmaneuver, and deals to close. The weekend getaway could wait until after the next quarter, the next expansion, the next milestone that always seemed to be just one more achievement away. I had no idea I was already losing the only thing that mattered while winning everything I thought I wanted. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 years after I'd started Harrison Technologies in our cramped apartment. Goldman Sachs wanted to discuss taking us public. Not maybe, not someday, now. They'd been watching our growth trajectory, and the numbers were impossible to ignore. We were perfectly positioned for an IPO that could value the company at over $200 million. I hung up the phone and sat in my corner office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, trying to process what I'd just heard. IPO, $200 million, Harrison Technologies on the NASDAQ. My first instinct was to call Rachel, to share this moment with the woman who'd believed in me when I was nothing more than ideas and ambition. But it was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. She'd be in the middle of teaching, helping some kids sound out words or explaining why 2 + 2 = 4. The world of kindergarten math seemed impossibly distant from the world of investment banks and public offerings. So I called my business partner instead, then my financial advisor, then my lawyer. By noon, my calendar was packed with meetings about S-1 filings and roadshow presentations and lockup periods. The machine of going public had started moving, and I was caught in its momentum. I finally got home at nearly 11 that night, my head spinning with valuation models and regulatory requirements. Rachel was already in bed, reading one of those novels she'd always loved but rarely had time for anymore. She looked up when I walked into our bedroom, and for a moment, she looked like the girl I'd married. curious, warm, fully present. I told her about the Goldman call, about the IPO possibility, about what it could mean for us financially. As I talked, I watched her expression shift from interest to something harder to read. When I finished explaining that we could potentially be worth tens of millions of dollars within the year, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she asked if that was what I wanted. The question caught me off guard. Of course it was what I wanted. We'd be set for life. We could buy anything, go anywhere, do whatever we dreamed of. We could start that family we'd been talking about for years without worrying about college funds or mortgage payments. We could travel the world, buy a vacation house, donate serious money to causes we cared about. Rachel nodded as I listed all the possibilities, but her smile looked strained. She congratulated me and said she was proud of what I'd built, then kissed me goodnight and went back to her book. I stood there in our walk-in closet, changing out of the $1,000 suit I'd worn to celebrate the biggest day of my career, wondering why I felt more alone than victorious. The IPO process consumed the next 8 months of my life completely. Due diligence, SEC filings, investor presentations, media interviews, every waking moment was dedicated to proving that Harrison Technologies deserved to be a publicly traded company. I traveled constantly, sometimes gone 3 or 4 days a week, explaining our business model to fund managers in New York, pension fund administrators in Chicago, institutional investors in San Francisco. Rachel's life, meanwhile, continued exactly as it had before. Same classroom, same kids, same modest teacher salary, same daily routine of lesson plans and parent conferences and construction paper crafts. The contrast between our worlds became starker every day. I'd call her from airport lounges and hotel rooms, trying to stay connected, but our conversations felt increasingly forced. She'd tell me about a student who'd finally mastered reading or a funny thing one of the kids had said, and I'd half listen while reviewing presentation materials. I'd tell her about meetings with investors who manage billions of dollars, and she'd make appropriate sounds of encouragement while clearly having no frame of reference for what any of it meant. The money started flowing even before the IPO launched. We did a pre-public funding round that valued my personal stake at $40 million. $40 million! I bought Rachel a new BMW, upgraded us to a house in Brookline with a pool and a 3-car garage, hired a housekeeper and a landscaper so she wouldn't have to worry about the mundane details of maintaining our increasingly complex lifestyle. She accepted all of it with the same gracious politeness she'd shown toward my earlier gifts, but I could see it made her uncomfortable. The house felt too big, too formal for someone who'd been perfectly happy in our tiny apartment. The car was beautiful, but practical Rachel had never cared about luxury vehicles. The housekeeper meant she couldn't do the small domestic tasks that had always given her satisfaction. I was trying to give her everything, but somehow each gift seemed to take something away from her instead. The IPO launched on a Thursday in November. Harrison Technologies opened at $18 a share and closed the first day at $26. My personal net worth increased by $60 million in 8 hours of trading. The local business journal wanted to interview me. Harvard Business School invited me to speak to students. I was 33 years old and worth more money than my father had made in his entire lifetime. Rachel took the day off school to be with me for the opening bell ceremony, which we watched from the offices of our investment bank. She wore a navy blue dress I'd bought her and smiled for all the photos. But when the champagne started flowing and everyone began celebrating, I noticed she'd stepped outside onto the terrace. I found her there 20 minutes later, standing alone and looking out over the city. When I asked if she was okay, she said she was just overwhelmed by everything. I wrapped my arms around her from behind, feeling like we were finally sharing this moment I'd been building toward for years. But when I started talking about our future, the freedom we'd have, the choices money would give us, the legacy we could build together, she seemed to withdraw again. She leaned back against me and nodded at the right moments, but I could feel her tension, like she was enduring the conversation rather than enjoying it. That night, we went to the most expensive restaurant in Boston to celebrate. I ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than Rachel used to make in a week, and we toasted to our success, our future, our dreams coming true. But sitting across from her at that white tablecloth table, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her genuinely laugh. The months after the IPO were a blur of wealth management and investment opportunities and social obligations. We were invited to charity galas where tables cost $10,000. We joined a country club I'd never have been able to afford 5 years earlier. I bought art for our walls because wealthy people were supposed to have art, and cars for our garage because wealthy people had car collections. Rachel went along with all of it, but she seemed to be performing the role of wealthy wife rather than living it. At the charity events, she'd make polite conversation about causes she'd never heard of before. At the country club, she'd sit by the pool reading while I played golf with potential business partners. She wore the designer clothes I bought her and smiled in the society page photos, but nothing about our new lifestyle seemed to bring her joy. Meanwhile, I was addicted to success in ways that scared me. Every deal had to be bigger than the last one. Every quarter had to show growth. Every opportunity had to be pursued aggressively because the market was moving fast and hesitation meant falling behind. I started looking at acquiring other companies, expanding into new markets, launching additional product lines. Harrison Technologies was no longer just a business. It was becoming an empire, and I was its architect and emperor. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the rush of building something that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in revenue. Rachel and I barely saw each other anymore. I'd leave for work before she woke up and come home after she'd gone to bed. Weekends were for client entertainment or strategic planning sessions or conference calls with our international offices. When we did spend time together, I was usually distracted by phone calls or emails that couldn't wait. She stopped trying to engage me in conversations about her work. She stopped sharing funny stories about her students or asking for advice about classroom challenges. She stopped waiting for me to come home for dinner, instead eating alone or with friends while I worked late or traveled. We were like roommates who split expensive bills but lived separate lives. The house was beautiful but empty. We had everything money could buy, but nothing that mattered. One evening in late spring, I came home from a week-long business trip to find Rachel sitting in our living room with a glass of wine and a stack of papers. She looked up when I walked in, and there was something different in her expression. Not angry, not sad, but resolved in a way that made my stomach clench. She said we needed to talk. I set down my luggage and joined her on the couch we'd bought because a decorator said it would look good in the space, not because either of us particularly liked it. The papers on the coffee table looked official, legal documents with our names at the top. She'd seen a lawyer. Not for divorce, she was quick to clarify, but for separation. She needed time to think about what she wanted, who she was becoming, whether the life we were building together was the life she actually wanted to live. I was stunned. We'd just achieved everything we'd ever dreamed of. We had financial security beyond our wildest imagination. We could do anything, go anywhere, be anyone we wanted to be. Why would she want to separate now when we'd finally made it? That's when she said something that stopped me cold. Harrison, you've become everything you wanted to be, but I don't know who I am anymore when I'm with you. She explained that somewhere in the journey from struggling newlyweds to wealthy power couple, she'd lost herself. She used to know what made her happy, what gave her purpose, what she believed in. Now she felt like she was playing a role in someone else's life, going through motions that had nothing to do with her actual values or desires. The money had changed everything, but not in ways she'd expected. Instead of giving her freedom, it had trapped her in a lifestyle that felt foreign and superficial. Instead of bringing us closer together, success had pushed us apart because I'd become obsessed with maintaining and expanding it while she'd remained essentially the same person she'd always been. She said she loved me, but she didn't recognize the man I'd become. The passionate, driven entrepreneur she'd fallen in love with had morphed into someone who measured every experience by its potential return on investment, who saw relationships as networking opportunities, who'd forgotten how to be present in moments that couldn't be monetized. I tried to argue with her, to explain that everything I'd done was for us, for our future, for the security and opportunities that money could provide.
But even as I spoke, I could hear how empty the words sounded. When was the last time we'd taken a walk just to enjoy each other's company? When was the last time we'd had a conversation that wasn't about schedules or logistics? When was the last time I'd asked about her dreams instead of assuming she shared mine?
She was moving into an apartment near her school, she said. Something small and simple, the kind of place we might have chosen together when we were young and broke and happy. She wanted to remember who she was when she wasn't defined by my success or limited by my ambitions. The separation wasn't necessarily permanent, she emphasized, but she needed space to figure out whether the woman she'd become in our wealthy life was someone she actually wanted to be, and whether the man I'd become was someone she could love for the rest of her life. I spent that night alone in our 8,000 square foot house, surrounded by expensive furniture and art and possessions that suddenly felt like props in a play I'd been performing without realizing it. The silence was deafening after years of constant activity, constant achievement, constant forward momentum. For the first time in years, I had nothing urgent to do, nowhere urgent to be, no deals to close or investors to impress. I sat in my home office, looking at the awards and photos and newspaper clippings that documented my rise from nobody to somebody, and wondered when being somebody had stopped including being Rachel's husband. Rachel moved out on a Saturday morning in June. She took only what she'd brought into the marriage and what she'd accumulated before money changed everything. Her books, her photos, her modest jewelry, her teaching supplies, and the few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value rather than monetary worth. I helped her load her Honda Civic, the same car she'd been driving when we met, despite my attempts over the years to upgrade her to something more expensive. She'd kept it running through maintenance and determination, the way she'd kept our relationship running through attention and love while I'd been focused on other things. Her new apartment was a one-bedroom place in Somerville, not far from where we'd lived when we were newlyweds. Walking through it felt like time travel. The same cramped kitchen, the same hardwood floors that needed refinishing, the same sense of potential and optimism that comes with small spaces and big dreams. Rachel seemed lighter there, more like herself than she'd been in our Brookline mansion. She made coffee in a French press instead of using our $1,000 espresso machine, and somehow it tasted better. She sat at a thrift store kitchen table to grade papers, and somehow the work looked more meaningful than it had spread across our marble breakfast bar. I stayed for an hour, helping her arrange furniture and hang pictures, pretending this was temporary, that we were just taking a break to figure things out. But watching her create a life that had no room for everything I'd built, I started to understand that the separation might not be the pause I'd hoped for. The house felt like a museum after she left, beautiful, expensive, and completely lifeless. I'd walk through rooms we'd never really used, past furniture we'd never been comfortable on, looking at art we'd never discussed buying. Everything was perfect and nothing was personal. I threw myself back into work because that's what I'd always done when life felt uncertain. But for the first time, the familiar rhythm of meetings and decisions and strategic planning felt hollow. I was managing a successful company, making money at a pace that still seemed unreal, building an empire that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in revenue. None of it mattered without someone to share it with. Rachel and I had dinner once a week, usually at small restaurants she chose in neighborhoods I'd forgotten existed. Places where meals cost $20 instead of $200, where the conversation was about the food and the atmosphere instead of being seen by the right people or networking with potential clients. Those dinners were torture and salvation at the same time. Rachel would tell me about her students, her summer reading plans, the small apartment improvements she was making with her own hands instead of hiring contractors. She seemed genuinely happy, more engaged with her life than she'd been in years. I'd tell her about business developments, acquisition opportunities, the speaking engagements, and board positions that came with success. But hearing myself talk, I realized how boring it all sounded, how disconnected from anything that mattered to actual human beings. One evening in late July, she asked me what I was passionate about besides work. The question stumped me completely.
I'd been so focused on building and achieving and accumulating that I'd forgotten what I enjoyed just for the sake of enjoyment. I used to love reading, but I only read business books now. I used to enjoy cooking, but we ate out or hired caterers. I used to like hiking, but I spent weekends in meetings or recovering from travel.
I realized that in becoming successful, I'd stopped being interesting, even to myself. That's when I started trying to remember who I'd been before the money. I bought a bike and started riding the paths along the Charles River on Sunday mornings. I signed up for a cooking class, relearning skills I'd abandoned when it became easier to make reservations than meals. I started reading fiction again, books that had nothing to do with market strategies or leadership principles. It felt good to do things that didn't have measurable outcomes, that couldn't be optimized or scaled or monetized. But it also felt lonely, because the person I most wanted to share these rediscoveries with was living in a one-bedroom apartment, rebuilding her own sense of self. The separation stretched into autumn, then winter. We kept having our weekly dinners, but they'd evolved from reconciliation attempts to something more like friendship. Rachel was dating someone, a colleague at her school named David, a fourth-grade teacher who coached soccer and drove a 10-year-old Subaru and had never given a thought to building wealth or achieving recognition. She didn't tell me about David directly, but I could see the signs. She seemed lighter, more relaxed, the way she used to look when we were first together. She'd mentioned weekend activities that clearly involved someone else. Hiking trips, museum visits, concerts at small venues I'd never heard of. It should have made me angry, but instead it made me sad. Sad that she was finding happiness with someone else, but also sad that the happiness she was finding was so simple, so attainable, so much like what we'd once shared before I'd decided it wasn't enough. I hired a private investigator, not to gather evidence for a divorce I didn't want, but to understand what I was competing with. The report was devastating in its simplicity. David Martinez, 34, master's degree in education, coached youth soccer on weekends, lived in a modest apartment, drove a reliable but unremarkable car, had never made more than $50,000 in a year. He was everything I'd been before success changed me, and everything I'd apparently stopped being in the process of becoming wealthy. I started showing up at places where I might accidentally encounter them. The coffee shop near her school, the hiking trail she'd mentioned visiting, the farmer's market in her neighborhood. I told myself I was just trying to understand what she saw in him, but really I was torturing myself by watching her be happy with someone who could give her so much less than I could. What I saw was devastating. Rachel with David looked like Rachel with me 15 years ago, animated, affectionate, fully present in whatever moment they were sharing. She'd laugh at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine. She'd take his hand while walking the way she used to take mine. She'd look at him with the kind of attention and interest she used to give me before I became too important to focus on anything but my own ambitions. David wasn't competing with my success. He was offering her something I'd forgotten how to provide: presence, attention. The sense that she was the most important thing in his world, not just another priority on an endless list of obligations. The divorce papers arrived in March, exactly 1 year after the separation began. Rachel had filed quietly, without drama or demands for half my wealth. She wanted almost nothing, just enough to buy a small house near her school, her car, her personal belongings, and her freedom. The legal documents were straightforward, but the note that came with them broke what was left of my heart. Harrison, I've spent this year trying to figure out whether I stopped loving you or whether I just stopped being able to find you underneath all the success. I think it's the second thing, which somehow makes this harder. The man I married is still in there somewhere, but I can't spend the rest of my life waiting for him to come back. You've built something incredible with your company, but you lost something incredible with us. I hope someday you figure out how to be proud of your success without letting it be the only thing that defines you. I hope you find someone who loves the person you've become instead of mourning the person you used to be. R. I sat in my home office, surrounded by all the trophies of my success, reading her words over and over. She was right about everything. I'd built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but I'd lost the woman who'd believed in me when I was worth nothing.
The worst part was that I couldn't even argue with her logic. David could give her something I've forgotten how to provide, a partner who was present, engaged, available for the small daily intimacies that make a marriage feel like home. I could give her money, security, luxury, status, and opportunities she'd never dreamed of, but I couldn't give her the one thing she actually wanted, a husband who chose her over everything else, every single day. I signed the papers without contest. Rachel deserved her freedom, and I deserved the consequences of my choices. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in May. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I turned off my phone, canceled all my meetings, and drove to Vermont without telling anyone where I was going. I ended up at the small inn where Rachel and I had honeymooned, back when a weekend getaway was a major expense and a bottle of champagne was a special occasion. The place hadn't changed much, still simple and comfortable, and focused on the kind of quiet pleasures that don't cost much money but somehow feel priceless. I spent 3 days hiking alone, eating at local diners, reading books that had nothing to do with business, remembering what it felt like to be a person instead of a productivity machine. For the first time in years, I had conversations with strangers, the waitress at breakfast, the guy at the hiking supply store, the elderly couple from Montreal who were celebrating their 40th anniversary. None of them cared about my net worth or my company's stock price or my plans for expanding into new markets. They talked about their grandchildren, their favorite trails, their memories of past visits to the area. Simple conversations about simple pleasures that somehow felt more meaningful than any business negotiation I'd conducted in months. On Sunday night, I called Rachel from the inn's landline. I didn't have a plan for what to say. I just wanted to hear her voice one more time as her husband instead of her ex-husband. She sounded surprised but not unfriendly when she realized it was me. I told her where I was, why I'd come, what I'd been thinking about during 3 days of hiking in solitude. I apologized for losing sight of what mattered, for choosing success over presence, achievement over attention, building an empire over building a life together, for assuming that providing for her financially was the same thing as loving her completely. I told her I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me during our weekly dinners, that success without connection was just expensive loneliness, that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the intimacy we'd lost while I was earning it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished talking, there was a long silence. Finally, she said she was proud of me for figuring it out, but it was too late for us. She was engaged to David. They were planning a small wedding in the fall, the kind of simple ceremony we'd had when we were young and broke and believed that love was enough to build a life on. She said she hoped I'd find someone who could love the person I was becoming, someone who could appreciate both my success and my humanity. She wished me happiness, real happiness, the kind that came from being fully present in your own life instead of always chasing the next achievement. I hung up the phone and sat in the inn's small lobby, looking out at the Vermont mountains we'd once hiked together, understanding finally that some losses can't be recovered, some mistakes can't be undone, some chances don't come twice. I'd set out to build a fortune and ended up losing a treasure. I'd achieved everything I thought I wanted and discovered it wasn't what I needed. I'd won the game of success and lost the game of life. The money was still there when I got home. The house, the cars, the investments, the recognition, the opportunities that came with wealth, all of it intact and meaningless. I was worth more than I'd ever dreamed possible and poorer than I'd been when Rachel and I were splitting pitchers of beer and sharing dreams in our tiny apartment. I started making changes immediately. Not dramatic, self-destructive changes, but deliberate choices about who I wanted to be going forward. I hired a CEO to run the day-to-day operations of Harrison Technologies, stepping back from the obsessive control that had consumed my life for years. I sold the Brookline mansion and bought a smaller place in Cambridge, walking distance from the coffee shop where Rachel and I had our first date. I started volunteering at a literacy program, teaching adults to read the way Rachel taught children. The work was humbling and rewarding in ways that closing million-dollar deals had never been. My students didn't care about my business success. They cared about whether I could help them understand why letters made sounds, and sounds made words, and words made meaning. I set up a foundation focused on education, not as a tax write-off or public relations move, but because I'd finally learned from Rachel what teachers really needed:
Supplies, support, recognition, and resources that went beyond what their salaries could provide. Every grant we funded felt like a small apology to the woman who tried to show me what meaningful work looked like while I'd been chasing headlines and valuations. The loneliness was crushing at first. I'd built a life that revolved around achievement and accumulation, and stepping back from that revealed how empty everything else had become. I had business associates, but few real friends. I had activities, but few passions. I had success, but no purpose beyond maintaining and expanding it. Dating felt impossible. How do you explain to someone new that you'd chosen money over love, ambition over intimacy, success over the person who'd believed in you when you were nobody? How do you prove that you've learned from losing everything that mattered while keeping everything that doesn't? I tried therapy, something I'd always thought was for people who had time for self-indulgence. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was about Rachel's age, with the same direct way of asking questions that cut through bullshit to get to the truth underneath. She helped me understand that my drive for success hadn't been about providing for Rachel or building our future together. It had been about proving something to myself, to my father who'd never believed I'd amount to much, to everyone who'd ever doubted that I could build something significant. Rachel had just been collateral damage in my war against my own insecurities. The irony was devastating. I'd spent years trying to become worthy of Rachel's love by achieving things that impressed other people, never realizing that she'd already loved me when I was worth nothing. I'd been solving a problem that didn't exist while creating problems that destroyed everything I actually cared about. 2 years after the divorce, I ran into Rachel and David at a farmer's market in Somerville. They were buying vegetables and flowers, the kind of simple Saturday morning activity she'd always enjoyed. She looked radiant, not the desperate happiness of someone trying to prove they'd made the right choice, but the quiet contentment of someone living the life they'd chosen. David was exactly what I'd expected, kind, attentive, completely present in their shared moment. When she introduced us, he shook my hand without awkwardness or animosity. He knew who I was, what I'd been to Rachel, but he wasn't threatened by the past because he was secure in their present.
We talked for a few minutes about safe topics, the weather, the market, changes in the neighborhood. Rachel mentioned that she'd heard about my foundation, that she was proud of the work we were doing for teachers and students. David asked thoughtful questions about literacy programs, genuinely interested in the cause rather than trying to impress me with his knowledge. They had to leave for David's nephew's soccer game, where he was assistant coach. As they walked away, I watched Rachel take his hand with the same natural affection she'd once shown me. But instead of jealousy, I felt something closer to gratitude. She'd found the kind of love she deserved, the kind I'd been too distracted to give her. That evening, I wrote Rachel a letter I never intended to send. I thanked her for loving me when I was worthy of love, for believing in my dreams when they were still dreams, for having the courage to leave when staying would have meant settling for less than she deserved. I told her that watching her with David had finally helped me understand what love was supposed to look like. Not a trophy to be won through achievement, but a gift to be given through presence. I never sent the letter, but writing it helped me forgive myself for the mistakes I'd made and the chances I'd missed. You can't rebuild a bridge that's been completely burned, but you can learn to build better bridges in the future. 3 years later, I met Jennifer at a book club. She was a social worker, divorced, with 2 teenage kids and a realistic understanding of how complicated love could be when you weren't 25 anymore. She didn't care about my money, except to worry that it might complicate things between us. She'd rather cook dinner at home than go to expensive restaurants, preferred hiking to luxury resorts, chose experiences over possessions. She reminded me of Rachel in some ways, the same commitment to work that mattered, the same ability to find joy in simple pleasures, the same desire for a partner who showed up fully for the relationship. But Jennifer had never known the version of me that chose success over love, so she didn't have to forgive that choice or worry about me making it again. I learned to love differently the second time. I kept regular hours, protected our weekends, made our relationship a priority instead of an afterthought.
When Harrison Technologies was acquired by a larger company for more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, I celebrated quietly with Jennifer over takeout Chinese food instead of throwing a party for business contacts I barely knew. The money is still there, invested wisely, donated regularly, used to create opportunities for other people rather than just accumulating for its own sake. But it's not the center of my life anymore. It's a tool that allows me to do meaningful work and support causes I care about, not a scorecard that determines my worth as a person. I'm grateful for the success, but I'm more grateful for the failure. Losing Rachel taught me what actually mattered, what love really required, what kind of man I wanted to be when the achievements were forgotten and the accolades stopped coming.
Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd figured it out sooner, if I'd chosen presence over productivity before it was too late to save my marriage. But those are dangerous thoughts that lead nowhere good. Rachel is happy with David, building the kind of life she always wanted with someone who understood from the beginning what she needed. And I'm building something different with Jennifer, not a second chance to get it right, but a first chance to love someone while knowing what love actually costs and what it's actually worth. The house in Cambridge has photos on the mantle now, pictures of Jennifer's kids, our weekend trips, quiet moments that nobody else would find impressive but that mean everything to us. Simple pleasures, shared dreams, the kind of ordinary magic I'd forgotten to notice while I was chasing extraordinary achievements. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you what moment in your life made you realize success meant something different than what you'd been chasing. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where the real stories get told.